Live long enough and consciously enough, and you may start becoming aware of something we may describe as cycles, periods, or phases within the lived experience of linear time. Cycles that repeat again and again, informing our experience with particular frequencies they bring along with them. Some of these cycles are short and others are long. The shorter they are, the easier it is to become aware of them as the repetition becomes observable. The really long cycles that repeat every hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years are harder to become aware of, but the fact that there is as much knowledge on them as there is, within astronomy and astrology for instance, is evidence that human civilization on Earth is much older than we officially accept, and that there may have been outside input of information on these grand celestial cycles from what could be termed as off-world beings. According to numerology, and as an example of a phase we may become aware of in our lives, there is a 9-year cycle that we all go through, with each subsequent year having a different value, 1, 2, 3, and so on. A few calculations can show you where does your current personal year sit within this 9-year cycle and what number frequency corresponds to it. Nature is also full of examples of cycles, seasonal, reproductive, and so on, that illustrate very vividly the phasic nature of the linear experience of life. In human beings too, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age, each period in our lives comes and goes with appropriate challenges and gifts. For some people, there are key moments that signify the transition from and the move towards the next phase, but sometimes it may go unnoticed. Have you ever took up a hobby as a child that you then abandoned, only to return to it several years later as an adult, wondering why you quit to begin with? Have you ever felt that your romantic nature suddenly became very prominent in your lived experience before it went back to where it used to be after some time had passed? Have you ever started really taking care of yourself and making the right choices, feeling certain that you've really turned over a new leaf, only to sadly go back to old habits and regress to what you were doing previously? Observed or unnoticed, these changes reveal a kind of impermanence or instability that can make us feel as if there were forces that push and pull us toward and away from things every so often to steer our attention according to some sort of divine plan we're not fully privy to. But being aware of the phasic nature of life may give us a little peace of mind as one discovers that this is just how life goes. Imagine having finally got rid of an unhealthy habit, thinking you would never go back to it, and then a year later you're back at it. Why? From one point of view, the choice to move on and kick the habit is already made in our minds, so the reason why we regress may have something to do with finding the reason why we chose this experience in the first place. A regressive phase may give us more insight and more opportunities to process this experience, eventually leading to higher levels of integration and forgiveness. So, if we ever regress to something we felt certain we had moved on from, we shouldn't feel disappointed and resort to judging the situation, but accept it and look at it as an opportunity to further comprehend it. Now, each phase of life seems to have its own character and its own needs. Therefore, certain activities, certain areas of life that matter to us during a certain period become obsolete when a new phase, when a new era comes along with its own characteristics and its own frequency. Imagine dealing with a psychological trauma. One may do some really deep shadow work to deal with this trauma and may feel that the work pays off as one starts to feel a lot better about it. But then, a few years later perhaps, the trauma resurfaces and one has to process it all over again. But each time we go through it, a new layer of meaning is uncovered that sheds new light on the subject. To illustrate, let's take the example of someone we can call Tom, that was bullied at school and consequently had to deal with the trauma of that experience as shadow work further down the timeline of his life. The way this works is that we dig deeper and deeper until we find another point of view, another reading of the event. It never ends really, as there are infinite points of view to read a situation from. But a lot of us think that once you deal with a psychological issue once, that's it, we're done. Well, that isn't impossible, but more often than not, every few years, when the stars align, so to speak, the issue will return in our minds and demand to be re-examined and reprocessed. So in our example, Tom may have had several run-ins with this psychological issue, each time uncovering a new layer of meaning. For instance, the first time our subject had to process this trauma may have felt really sore, as it may have been quite a fresh memory, but with integration work he may have felt a certain relief and release, and the effort to forgive or perhaps to try to understand the life challenges the bully was facing at the time that led to him becoming aggressive in nature may have been part of the products of this early processing phase. At a later run-in, several years later, Tom, while revisiting the bully in his mind, may have discovered that the experience of getting bullied was a strengthening experience that was ultimately to his advantage, which is a really mature place to arrive at, especially if you have been emotionally hurt. This being the case on an intellectual level, emotionally Tom may have felt the tension of residual anger towards his bully resurfacing, despite of the fact that he had previously forgiven him in his mind. Contemplating on his bully may have also provided contrast in our subject's life as an early lesson in polarity. Discovering what we are not sometimes is the way for us to discover what we are. Even further down the timeline, Tom has really worked on becoming multidimensional in his thinking and manages to arrive at a conclusion that could never previously been possible if it hadn't been for the earlier shadow work. He came to the realization that he had a hand at creating, or at least sustaining, the bully. In other words, his reaction to the bully created or sustained the dynamic that later became the trauma. Tom is now free to imagine a possibility in an alternate reality where he reacts in a way that the bully is neutralized and even becomes best friends with him. The possibility and the potential for that timeline has finally become so obvious to Tom, and this is not a reason to regret, but a reason to contemplate one's real power. Of course, hindsight is one of the things that we wish we had before, but cultivating multidimensionality in our thinking can possibly lead us to these discoveries before they have to become part of what we call hindsight. If we only embrace and accept the phasic nature of life, we may get some peace when back and forth type of situations manifest themselves. Not only can we feel relieved in accepting them as natural parts of life, but we can also rejoice, for we will have the opportunity to comprehend something important at a level we couldn't before. As a further illustration, but also as a side discussion in its own right, for people that consider themselves as being on the spiritual path, this type of revisitations of concepts that occur in a sort of phasic, periodic way is a regular experience as we regularly investigate concepts that challenge us in this way. What we learn and the information we are exposed to constitute seeds of meaning that grow within us in parallel to our own growth. With time and effort, we are able to uncover yet more layers and aspects in the infinite range of meaning we can derive as conscious observers of life. And a case in point would be to briefly discuss the continued evolution of my relationship with two really important spiritual bodies of work. The Law of One and A Course in Miracles are both channeled material and both contain spiritual teachings that are very much in alignment with each other, even though they use different terminology. Through the years, they have both become very popular amongst people with an interest in spirituality and are continuously studied and talked about within groups online or in classes and seminars. Of course, with concepts and teachings as fundamental and deep as these books contain, it needs to be said that there are many levels of understanding that we go through before we can say that we have integrated a concept and allowed it to become a lived experience. This very essay is an illustration of my own journey through my different levels of comprehension of this incredible material, and is offered here as an attempt to further the shared experience aspect of awakening as it manifests within a phasic type of life experience that evolves and expands in linear time. For this particular illustration, I'm using these books as an example of how our comprehension and integration of spiritual concepts evolve in phases. A Course in Miracles consists of daily lessons that one studies, and their purpose, as it seems to me, is a step-by-step unbrainwashing of one's intellectual faculties. Slowly but surely, as one goes through the lessons, one becomes aware of the illusory nature of reality and its relationship to the ego. The ego then becomes not just a psychological term, that relates to the conscious mind, but the very thing that keeps the illusion of separation that this reality is based on going. And this illusion of separation was chosen and created by us, the sonship, the Creator's creation. This illusory world we created outside of oneness, outside of the whole, is seen as the attempt of the creation to experience what it is like to be outside of oneness. Now, nothing can exist outside of the whole, or in other words, nothing can be separate from God, and yet the illusion of separation is maintained by the ego, which is the point of consciousness from which we look out into the world, cut off from oneness existing within the bubble the ego has created for us. The truth of oneness is just there waiting for us at a moment's notice. Our Creator beckons us to return home, and all we have to do is resist no more, but it is the ego that keeps resisting this call. One could say that for A Course in Miracles, ascension is the return home of the prodigal son, as the Course helps us remember our own identity as children of the one infinite Creator and return home to our Creator and true oneness. The Law of One consists of transcribed Q&A sessions that go in depth into explaining the various densities of existence and how we move from one to the next within our evolutionary journey through many lifetimes. The realm of polarity is an important concept here, as it characterizes some of the lower densities and is expressed as the duality of service to others and service to self. These are the two main pathways, positive and negative, that a mind-body-spirit complex can choose to take or polarize within. As we ascend up the densities, however, polarity ceases to exist and the two pathways eventually merge. The Law of One describes how creation came forth through a series of distortions of oneness. Not additions, as you can't add anything to the whole, but distortions. It's oneness, but distorted as if one applied a filter lens that changed not its nature, but the experience of it. And these very distortions that came forth from the original source realized logi and sub-logi, angels and archangels, beings of consciousness so vast they are responsible for the life parameters of entire planets, systems, or galaxies. These parameters may have to do with almost every little aspect of our lived experience, including our experience of free will. One could say that for the Law of One, ascension is like an exploration of consciousness, a natural musical progression of frequencies, as one's journey through the densities is the means by which the all-knowing Creator knows himself. For both books, ascension is a form of reunification, or letting go of the illusion of separation. But it seemed to me that according to A Course in Miracles, it is more about finally letting go of the ego and its illusory reality, whereas for the Law of One, these very aspects of the journey, the illusion of separation, are in themselves part of the purpose of life. In other words, what the Law of One presents as the journey in consciousness, the Course in Miracles presents as the sonship's decision to experience separation. Now, please remember that this is simply what was my own subjective reading of this material that, as we said, evolves in time for everyone as our consciousness explores further and further layers. But at the time, I would have short little mystical implosions each time I tried to reconcile the two apparently differing views the two books offer. I knew all along that there was a reconciliation in potentiation. I would meditate, contemplate, and visualize how the two views could coexist, and it wasn't until during a later phase of my life, where I revisited the task of trying to reconcile the two texts, that I received a sort of explanation. So I visualized God, the source of all sources, and visualized how creation was manifested within the Creator at His will. The creation, being an aspect of the Creator, shares in His creative qualities, and so created further the logi and the sub-logi we mentioned earlier, and they in turn created the galaxies, the systems, planets, people, and so on, as we move along the theoretical timeline of evolution. And so, in the way that God willed it to be, there came a point where it is logical to assume that as we went through more and more distortions of oneness, we moved closer to a potentiality of loss of memory and loss of identity. This loss of memory is on one hand deliberate and part of the divine plan, as per the Law of One, but on the other, it can be viewed in Course in Miracles terms, as in We chose to experience this illusion, and our ego is sustaining it for us. The Law of One describes the grander picture and presents a large-scale map of consciousness, and from that grand viewpoint, all is seen as part of the overall design. But the Course in Miracles assumes a viewpoint much closer to the human experience of what could be seen as our own higher self, trying to wake us up and get us out of the illusion of separation. Two sides of one coin. I was finally able to see the two books never contradicted each other, they just offered the truth from two different perspectives. In our attempt to map out the levels of reality we seem to inhabit in time and space, as well as reach to the part of us that exists beyond them, the Law of One and A Course in Miracles have helped us formulate a type of theory of everything that helps us mentally structure the matrix of consciousness in a way that feels like teaching as well as a memory of what we already know. The reason why these books feel like memories is because they teach us the nature of consciousness, and consciousness is us. So it is us we get to better comprehend when we read these books. It is us we study. It is deep within we reach, pure indulgence of self within self. What phases are in space-time, that is, distinct separate time periods, in time-space, they are all now. They are all frequencies of energy pulsating in the eternal now. Everything that ever was and everything that ever will be is all happening simultaneously. As hard as this truth is to become integrated in our lived experience, pondering on it, meditating on it, may help us see permanence in apparent impermanence, certainty in uncertainty, and clarity in confusion. As I was finishing this video essay, I decided to meditate and ask for help with the concepts of space-time and time-space. Meditation being what it is, I received a visual of my bicycle, and especially the wheels. It follows the wheel of time. I then realized that the outer circle of the wheel is space-time, the center point is time-space, and the lines that connect them are the routes we can take to go from one to the other. So in meditation, we go from space-time to time-space. And when our higher self, angels and guides communicate with us or leave us messages, they do the same. They come from the center to the outside surface. This 2D image of the wheel becomes a 3D spiral as we evolve in consciousness, and the distance between the outer circle to the center becomes smaller each time we go around it until we merge with time-space. Obviously a concept that deserves lots of integration, but offered here as an afterthought.